Seconds after Mike Tyson stepped forward, 3 grown men froze in place. A crowded grocery store fell into unnatural silence, and a pregnant woman who had been seconds away from humiliation realized something extraordinary was about to happen. But to understand how a routine afternoon turned into the moment that changed everything, we need to go back to the beginning, before anyone noticed, before anyone cared, before anyone understood who was standing there and why the next few moments would leave witnesses talking for years. Because earlier that day the store looked like any other busy afternoon. Carts squeaking across tile floors, cash registers beeping, children tugging at parents' arms, people rushing through aisles with their minds fixed on errands rather than each other. And among them walked Mike Tyson, hood pulled low, sunglasses on, posture relaxed, moving quietly through the aisles like a man who had learned long ago that fame was loud but anonymity was priceless. He wasn't there as a champion, wasn't there as a celebrity, wasn't there looking for attention. He just wanted to pick up a few groceries and leave unnoticed. And for a while that plan worked, until something subtle shifted in the air, the kind of shift most people never notice, the kind that only someone who has lived through conflict recognizes instantly. A change in tone, a tightening of voices, laughter that wasn't friendly, words that carried an edge, and Mike heard it before he saw it. A voice behind him, sharp and impatient, telling someone to hurry up, another voice joining in, louder, mocking, followed by laughter that didn't belong in a harmless conversation. And when Mike turned slightly, he saw her, a young pregnant woman standing alone at a self-checkout machine, her hands trembling as she tried to scan items that refused to register, her shoulders tense, her posture tired, her belly unmistakable beneath a loose sweater. She wasn't slow because she didn't care. She was slow because she was exhausted, because pregnancy had drained her energy, because the machine wasn't cooperating, because life doesn't always move at the speed demanded by impatient strangers. And behind her stood 3 men in their 20s, tall, loud, confident in the careless way men are when they believe no one will challenge them. One leaned on a cart with a smirk, another scrolled on his phone while throwing insults without looking up. The third stepped closer than necessary, invading her space. And their words weren't shouted. They didn't need to be. They were designed to humiliate quietly, to make her feel small without causing a scene, to test how far they could go without consequences. And the woman tried to ignore them, tried to focus on the screen in front of her, but her fingers shook as she pressed buttons. Her breathing grew shallow, and Mike watched the way her eyes flickered toward the floor, the way she avoided eye contact, the way her body language screamed discomfort. And he also watched everyone else, the customers in line who pretended not to hear, the cashier who glanced over and then looked away, the people who shifted their weight but stayed silent, because silence is easier than intervention. And intervention always comes with risk, and risk is something most people avoid unless forced. And Mike understood that instinct well. He had lived in environments where stepping in could cost you everything. But he had also lived long enough to know what happens when nobody steps in. And the men sensed that silence too, their confidence growing with each second they went unchallenged. One of them laughed louder and said something about people who didn't know how to use technology. Another rolled his eyes dramatically. And then the third man kicked the wheel of the woman's cart, not hard enough to knock it over, but hard enough to make a point, hard enough to send a jolt through her body, and she gasped, stumbled slightly, grabbing the counter to steady herself, her face flushing with embarrassment and fear. And at that exact moment, Mike Tyson stopped moving, the items in his basket forgotten, his body completely still, and something changed in his expression, not anger, not rage, but focus, the same focus he once had when the bell rang and the crowd roared and everything else disappeared. Because Mike knew this moment wasn't about groceries, wasn't about strangers, wasn't about inconvenience, it was about power. And power always reveals itself in small moments long before it explodes in big ones. And the men still didn't notice him yet, still didn't realize who was watching, still didn't understand that the atmosphere around them had shifted from casual cruelty to something far more dangerous. Because Mike wasn't rushing toward them, wasn't shouting, wasn't creating a scene. He was observing, measuring, calculating, just like he used to do in the ring, studying opponents before deciding whether they deserved his response. And as the woman tried again to scan an item and failed, one of the men sighed. dramatically, and muttered something under his breath that made the others laugh. And that laugh was the sound that finally pushed Mike forward. He removed his sunglasses slowly, not for dramatic effect, but because he needed to see clearly. He stepped out of his line and walked toward the self-checkout area with the kind of calm that made people instinctively move out of his way without knowing why. His footsteps weren't loud. His presence wasn't aggressive, but there was weight in it, and the woman didn't notice him at first. She was too focused on the screen in front of her, too focused on not crying, too focused on finishing the transaction before the humiliation became unbearable. And the men still didn't recognize him either. They saw only another customer approaching, another bystander who would probably look away like everyone else. And that assumption was their first mistake, because Mike stopped beside the woman, not in front of her, not behind her, but slightly to her side, positioning himself in a way that wasn't confrontational, but wasn't passive either. And he spoke quietly, so quietly that only she could hear him at first, asking if she was okay. And she looked up, surprised, her eyes meeting his for the first time. And in that moment, she saw something she hadn't seen in anyone else around her that day. Not pity, not curiosity, but certainty. And before she could answer, one of the men finally noticed Mike and laughed, asking who he was supposed to be. A bodyguard, a hero, someone looking for attention. And Mike didn't respond immediately. He didn't argue, didn't insult, didn't escalate. He simply turned his head slightly and looked at them, really looked at them. And that look was different from anything they'd seen before, because it wasn't hostile, it wasn't fearful, it wasn't emotional, it was controlled, deliberate, and unsettling. And for the first time since they'd started harassing the woman, the men felt something they hadn't expected. To feel that day, uncertainty, and the store, without realizing why, began to fall quiet. Not because someone shouted, not because alarms went off, but because people sensed that something irreversible was about to happen. And somewhere in that silence, seconds before anyone fully understood what was unfolding, Mike Tyson took one slow step forward, and the story truly began. The tallest of the three men laughed when Mike stepped forward, but the laugh didn't sound as confident as it had seconds earlier. It came out sharper, forced, like he was trying to convince himself that nothing had changed. "What? You gonna lecture us now?" he said, his voice loud enough for nearby shoppers to hear, but not loud enough to draw security. And Mike didn't answer right away. He didn't raise his voice, didn't move aggressively. He simply looked at the man the way a storm looks calm before it breaks. And for a moment the man held his ground, puffed his chest, rolled his shoulders like size alone could rewrite reality, while his two friends watched closely, their earlier amusement slowly dissolving into something closer to caution. Because even they could feel it now, that subtle shift in energy, that moment when a situation stops being casual and starts becoming dangerous. And the pregnant woman stood frozen between them, her hands resting on the counter, unsure whether to move, unsure whether to speak, unsure whether stepping away would make things worse. And Mike noticed everything, the tremor in her fingers, the way she leaned slightly away from the man, the way her breathing had changed. And he spoke again, still calm, still controlled. "You don't talk to her like that," he said, not as a request, not as a threat, but as a statement of fact. And the man scoffed, shaking his head as if the idea itself offended him. "Or what?" he replied, his voice rising slightly now, his pride refusing to let him back down in front of his friends and strangers. And Mike didn't blink, didn't argue, didn't repeat himself. He simply stood there, his presence suddenly filling the space between them in a way that made it impossible to ignore him anymore. And people nearby began to notice. Carts stopped rolling, conversations paused mid-sentence, a cashier glanced up from a register and frowned, sensing something was off. And one of the man's friends finally took a closer look at Mike's face, his eyes narrowing slightly as recognition began to form. But he wasn't sure yet, wasn't confident enough to say it out loud. So he stayed silent, watching carefully. And the tallest man, still unaware of who he was dealing with, took a step closer to Mike, invading his space deliberately, testing boundaries. "You think you're tough, or something?" he said, his tone half mocking, half challenging. And Mike didn't move an inch, didn't step back, didn't step forward. He simply waited. And that waiting was what made the man uncomfortable. Because most people respond with anger or fear, not silence. And silence feels like judgment, like calculation, like someone deciding whether you matter. and the man felt that decision being made in real time, which only made him more defensive, more reckless, more determined to prove he was in control, and he laughed again, louder this time, but the sound rang hollow. "Mind your own business," he said, and as he spoke, he reached out and shoved Mike's shoulder, not hard enough to start a fight, not soft enough to be ignored, just enough to assert dominance, and the moment his hand made contact, the entire store seemed to inhale at once, the kind of collective breath people take when they sense something irreversible has just happened, and Mike looked down slowly at the hand resting on his shoulder, then looked back up at the man's face, and for a brief second there was nothing in his expression, no anger, no smile, no threat, just clarity, and the man felt it before he understood it, that something had shifted beyond his control, and before he could pull his hand back, before he could laugh it off, before he could say another word, Mike spoke again, his voice lower now, quieter, but somehow more powerful than shouting. "You get one chance to walk away," he said, and the words didn't sound dramatic, didn't sound rehearsed. They sounded final, and the man's friends exchanged glances, one of them finally whispering under his breath, "Bro, I think that's Mike Tyson." And the tallest man froze for half a second, his confidence cracking just enough for doubt to slip through. But pride rushed in immediately to seal the crack. "Shut up," he muttered, but his voice wasn't as steady as before, and Mike didn't repeat himself, didn't escalate, didn't touch him. He simply stood there, waiting, and the silence stretched on longer than anyone expected. Long enough for phones to rise discreetly, long enough for customers to stop pretending nothing was happening, long enough for the pregnant woman to slowly step half a pace away from the man. And in that silence the man realized something terrifying, that he was no longer performing for his friends, no longer playing a role. He was standing in front of someone who didn't care about his size, didn't care about his bravado, didn't care about his pride. And that realization made him feel smaller than he'd ever felt in his life. And yet instead of backing down immediately, he hesitated, trapped between fear and ego. And that hesitation was the most dangerous moment of all. For a moment that felt longer than it actually was, nobody moved. Not the tallest man, not his friends, not the pregnant woman, not the people watching from behind their carts. Because everyone sensed they were standing at the edge of something that could go very wrong very fast. And the tallest man felt it most of all. The pressure of dozens of eyes, the weight of his own pride, the quiet certainty in Mike Tyson's voice, and slowly, almost imperceptibly, his hand slipped off Mike's shoulder, his fingers loosening as if they no longer belonged to him, and he took a step back, then another, his confidence draining away with each movement, while his friends followed his lead without saying a word, their earlier laughter replaced by silence. And in that moment Mike didn't chase them, didn't insult them, didn't claim victory. He simply turned slightly toward the pregnant woman, his posture softening, his voice returning to the calm tone he'd used before any of this began. "Take your time," he said gently, and the words felt different now, not like polite advice but like protection, and the woman nodded, her eyes glistening as she whispered thank you, her hands steadier now as she finished scanning her items, while the men walked away toward the exit, their shoulders tense, their heads lowered, not defeated by fists but by something far more unsettling, the realization that real power doesn't need to shout. And the store slowly began to breathe again. Conversations resumed. Carts rolled forward, cash registers beeped, but nothing felt quite the same, because everyone had just witnessed a moment that exposed something uncomfortable about human nature, how easy it is to look away, how rare it is to step in, and how quickly cruelty collapses when it meets someone who refuses to tolerate it. And when the woman finished paying, she gathered her bags slowly, turning once more toward Mike as if she wanted to say something else, but couldn't find the words, and Mike simply nodded again, not seeking gratitude, not seeking attention. And then he picked up his own basket and walked away, blending back into the crowd like nothing extraordinary had happened. But for the people who had seen it, nothing about that afternoon would ever feel ordinary again, because later that day, stories began to spread, whispered conversations in the parking lot, messages sent to friends, posts written without names. "You won't believe what happened today," someone said. "Mike Tyson stepped in when 3 guys were harassing a pregnant woman." Another added, and by the next morning, the story had grown. exaggerated in some places, simplified in others, but the core truth remained the same. There had been no punches, no shouting, no chaos, just a moment where cruelty stopped because it was finally confronted, and the men who had walked away carried that moment with them longer than they expected, replaying it in their minds. Not because they had been humiliated publicly, but because they had seen something they didn't understand. A man who didn't need violence to command respect. A man who didn't need to prove anything to feel powerful. And the pregnant woman carried it too, not as fear but as relief, as proof that strangers can sometimes become shields when the world feels hostile. And Mike Tyson carried nothing from that day except the quiet knowledge that sometimes the strongest thing a person can do isn't throwing a punch, isn't winning a fight, isn't dominating an opponent, but choosing the exact moment to step forward and say enough. Because in that grocery store, surrounded by ordinary people and ordinary noise, a simple act of intervention revealed a deeper truth, that bullying survives on silence, that courage often appears quietly, and that real strength isn't measured by how hard someone hits, but by how effectively they stop violence before it ever begins. And long after the carts were emptied and the store closed, and the people went home, one thing remained certain: 3 men walked into that store, believing power belonged to whoever was loudest, biggest, and most aggressive. But they walked out knowing something very different. That sometimes the most dangerous person in the room is the one who never raises his voice, never throws a punch, and never needs to prove who he is. Because the moment he decides to speak, everything changes.